Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I started as a junior analyst, worked my way up to a decent position, handling data reports and presentations. 6 months before the incident, we got a new manager. She walked in like she owned the place, started making changes right away, and treated everyone below her like personal servants. The woman had this attitude that her time was infinitely more valuable than anyone else's, and she made sure we all knew it. That morning started like any other Tuesday. I grabbed my usual coffee from the break room and settled in at my desk around 8. Had a big presentation scheduled for later that afternoon, one I've been prepping for weeks. Around 10, my stomach started feeling off. Not terrible at first, just uncomfortable. I figured maybe I ate something weird for breakfast and tried to push through it. By 11, the pain had gotten significantly worse. My stomach felt like someone was twisting it from the inside. I was sweating through my shirt, and I could feel my face burning up. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even type. This wasn't just some minor stomach bug. Something was seriously wrong. I looked across the office toward her door. She was on one of her conference calls, probably discussing something she considered earth-shatteringly important. I knew interrupting her would be risky, but at this point, I didn't have much choice. The pain was getting unbearable. I managed to stand up and walk over to her office, trying my best to look somewhat normal, even though every step felt like torture. I knocked gently on her doorframe. She looked up with this annoyed expression covering the phone's mouthpiece. She asked what I wanted in an irritated tone and mentioned she was on a call. I apologized for interrupting, but told her I wasn't feeling well at all. I explained that I thought I might need to leave early or maybe call an ambulance. Her eyes rolled so hard I thought they might get stuck. She asked if I was kidding her right now and said I couldn't be serious. She reminded me we had that presentation at 3 and asked if I was really telling her I wanted to leave early. She told me to just take some aspirin and get back to work. Another wave of pain hit me, and I had to grip the door frame to stay upright. I insisted I wasn't exaggerating and told her this was really bad. I said I thought something might be seriously wrong. She let out this long, dramatic sigh, like I'd just ruined her entire day. She complained that I was always making everything into a huge drama. She finally said fine, whatever, and told me to call an ambulance if I absolutely must. But she warned me that this better not be some fake emergency to get out of work. She also told me not to even think about billing it to the company. I turned around and stumbled back to my desk, barely able to walk straight. My co-workers were staring, some looking genuinely concerned, others probably wondering what the commotion was about. I dialed emergency services with shaking hands and explained my symptoms. They told me an ambulance would arrive within 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. I sat hunched over my desk, trying to breathe through the pain. Then I heard her voice again, this time loud enough for the entire office to hear. She announced loudly that someone had called an ambulance and said really in a sarcastic tone. She mentioned she hoped everyone knew we had strict budget policies and that this kind of thing couldn't become a habit around here. Several people looked uncomfortable. One of my colleagues mouthed, asking if I was okay. I just nodded weakly, too miserable to respond. When the paramedics finally arrived, the whole office went quiet. They came in with their equipment, asking me questions about my symptoms while checking my vitals. My blood pressure was elevated, and they said my abdomen felt rigid. They decided I needed to go to the hospital right away. They loaded me onto the stretcher, which was mortifying with everyone watching. When they wheeled me out, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing near her office door, arms crossed, looking completely unimpressed. Not concerned, not sympathetic, just annoyed that this inconvenience was happening during work hours. At the emergency room, they ran blood tests, did an ultrasound, and within an hour, a doctor came in looking serious. The doctor explained that my white blood cell count was elevated and the imaging showed acute appendicitis. He said my appendix was inflamed and could rupture if they didn't operate soon. He told me they needed to do surgery today. Everything moved quickly after that. They prepped me for surgery, and before I knew it, I was counting backward from 10 when the anesthesia kicked in. I woke up several hours later feeling groggy and sore. My mom was there, and a couple of friends had stopped by. The surgery went well, the doctor explained. They'd removed my appendix laparoscopically, and I'd need about a week to recover before even thinking about returning to work. Later that evening, after my visitors left, I noticed my phone had several notifications. One was a voicemail from work. From her, specifically. I played it. She said, "Hey there," and mentioned she'd heard about my appendix situation. She commented that it was a pretty dramatic timing with a presentation and all. She went on to say that since I'd be sitting around recovering, she figured I could work on finalizing those presentation slides from home. She explained that they'd rescheduled the presentation for tomorrow afternoon, so she'd need everything by morning. She told me to send the slides to her email when I was done and ended with thanks. I listened to it twice, convinced I must have misheard. She actually expected me to work on a presentation from my hospital bed, hours after having emergency surgery. My sister came back with coffee and noticed my expression. My sister asked what was wrong and if I was in pain. I told her no, just dealing with workplace insanity. After I got home and had a few days to recover, I decided I'd had enough. This wasn't just about me anymore. If she treated me like this during a medical emergency, how was she treating everyone else? I needed to contact someone higher up who could actually do something about this situation. I drafted an email to the company's CEO. I kept it professional but detailed, explaining everything from her initial dismissal of my symptoms to the voicemail requesting work during recovery. I attached screenshots of her messages and the voicemail recording itself. The subject line read simply, "Concerns about managerial behavior." I hit send before I could second guess myself. 3 days later, I received a response requesting a meeting at headquarters. My stomach dropped, but I agreed. Walking into the CEO's office felt surreal. He sat behind this massive desk, and there she was, sitting in one of the chairs across from him, looking decidedly less confident than usual. The CEO thanked me for coming in. He said he'd thoroughly reviewed my email and all the attached evidence. He mentioned that he was deeply troubled by what he'd seen. He turned to her and said he'd like to hear her explanation for this behavior. She stammered that she was under significant pressure with the presentation deadline. She said she didn't mean for her words to come across harshly and claimed she was just trying to keep the team focused and productive. The CEO said that pressure was never an excuse for treating employees without basic human decency. He pointed out that her response to a medical emergency was not only inappropriate but potentially dangerous. He added that requesting work from someone in a hospital bed after surgery crossed every professional boundary they had. She started fidgeting. The CEO continued by saying her conduct reflected poorly on the entire organization. He explained that they prided themselves on maintaining a respectful workplace culture, and her actions went against those values. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The CEO announced that effective right away, she was being removed from her managerial position. He said she'd be reassigned to a different department in a role with no supervisory responsibilities. He mentioned that human resources would discuss the details with her separately. She mumbled something that might have been an apology, standing up quickly. She left without making eye contact with either of us. The CEO then turned to me and said he wanted me to know that speaking up about this took courage, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. He told me if I ever experienced anything like this again, I shouldn't hesitate to reach out. I thanked him and told him I really appreciated him taking this seriously. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. I'm working as a contractor in the Southwest. I don't mind the long drives through the desert, but there's one thing that's always bothered me about these trips: the border patrol checkpoints. Border security is important, but some of these checkpoints are placed in the most ridiculous locations. There's one near Alamogordo, New Mexico that's particularly absurd. It's about 50 miles from the actual border, sitting right in the middle of a military base, in the most desolate desert you've ever seen. This area is used when a bombing range. Nobody is sneaking through there unless they have a death wish and really terrible navigation skills. I've been through this checkpoint probably 30 times over the past year. Each time it was the same routine. They'd ask if I was a citizen, I'd say yes, and they'd wave me through. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds, but something about the pointlessness of it all had been eating at me. These officers were just going through the motions, and I was tired of being part of their security theater. So, on this Tuesday, after dealing with a difficult client in Phoenix and facing a 9-hour drive ahead of me, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to answer every single question they asked with absolute precision and complete honesty. If they wanted to do their job, I'd help them do it thoroughly. I was about 6 hours into my drive when I approached the checkpoint. The sun was beating down mercilessly, and I could see the heat waves rising off the asphalt. There were already a couple vehicles ahead of me in line. I grabbed my cell phone, turned on the video camera, and set it on my dashboard. I wanted to remember this. My white contractor van, loaded with equipment and tools, pulled up to the checkpoint station. The officer who approached my window looked like he'd never smiled a day in his life. His face was set in a permanent scowl. The officer asked flatly if I was a U.S. citizen. I asked him to repeat himself, pretending I hadn't heard clearly. He asked again if I was a U.S. citizen. I told him yes and made sure to mention that I was born a U.S. citizen in Albuquerque. He nodded and asked if there was anyone in the vehicle with me. I said not that I knew of, with my voice going up at the end like it was a question. He looked at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language and repeated my words back to me, asking what I meant by that. I explained that there wasn't anyone with me this morning when I loaded my stuff up, but I hadn't actually looked in the back since then, so I couldn't be completely sure. The officer asked where I was coming from. I told him I was coming from Phoenix, Arizona, and that I worked for this contracting company that did electrical work for commercial buildings, mostly retail spaces and some office complexes. I started explaining how my boss had started the company back in 2008, right after the housing market crashed, which was actually pretty brave timing if you thought about it. He cut me off and asked if I'd stopped anywhere since Phoenix. I said yes. He wanted to know where and why I'd stopped. I explained that I'd stopped in Tucson for breakfast because there was this great taco place with amazing green sauce. I started telling him that if he liked breakfast tacos, he should really check it out because they made their own tortillas. He interrupted me again and asked if I'd stopped anywhere else. I told him I'd stopped for gas in Las Cruces because they usually had better gas prices than Arizona, and my boss really liked when I kept the fuel costs down. I went on about how he was very conscious about the budget, which I appreciated because it showed he was thinking about the long-term health of the company. The officer cut me off once more and asked if I hadn't looked in the back of the van during either of these stops. I said no and asked why I would. I asked him if he looked in his trunk every time he stopped to take a leak. His jaw tightened. By this point, we'd been talking for at least 3 minutes. This was a one-lane checkpoint, and I could see cars starting to pile up behind me. The officer's eyes had taken on this special quality of pure hatred. He asked with obvious restraint if I minded if he looked in the back of my vehicle. I told him it wasn't my vehicle. He repeated my words back to me when a question, asking what I meant. I explained that it belonged to my boss, Richard Patterson, and that really it belonged to Patterson Contracting Solutions, LLC. I started telling him how Richard was great to work for and how he used to work for this bigger company but decided to branch out on his own. The officer interrupted and asked again if he could look in the back of the vehicle. I said I wasn't sure I was comfortable making that decision for my boss. I offered to call him if the officer wanted, but explained that it was really his vehicle. The officer asked if that meant no, that he couldn't look in the back. I clarified that I wished I could help, but I just couldn't make that decision about someone else's property. He told me to stay put and turned around to speak into his radio. I could see him getting more animated when he talked. I said sure thing and asked where I would go anyway. I added that I was just trying to help. A few minutes later, another officer showed up with a drug-sniffing dog. The handler started walking the dog around my van in a circle. I may have accidentally bumped the accelerator while the van was in park. It was August. Must have been over 100 degrees out there. The engine revved a bit and the exhaust probably didn't smell great for that poor dog. They completed their circle and found exactly nothing. I asked what the dog was for. The officer explained that the dog was sniffing for drugs. I asked why there would be drugs in my van. He told me I should leave now. I asked if that meant I was free to go. He confirmed that yes, I was free to go. I thanked him enthusiastically for all his hard work out there and reminded him to stay hydrated in the heat. When I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The officer was just standing there, shaking his head. Behind him, I could see at least 15 cars, backed up in line, all waiting because of me. The whole interaction had probably taken 10 minutes. I couldn't stop grinning for the next 50 miles. I've been playing Pokemon Go for years now, pretty much since it came out. I know some people think it's silly for someone my age to be playing a mobile game about catching cartoon monsters, but it gets me out of the house and gives me a reason to explore my neighborhood. I live in a small private community in Illinois, one of those old neighborhoods that used to be all summer houses decades ago. You can walk the entire area in about 90 minutes if you really wanted to. There's this one Pokestop at the end of my street that I hit up every single day because the game gives you bonus items if you collect from the same stop daily. Miss a day and you start over from scratch? A few weeks back, I was having a pretty standard evening. I'd just gotten my car back from the shop after a minor accident, and I was being extra careful about everything on the road. The insurance company had given me a loaner with Wisconsin plates while my car was being fixed, and I was still getting used to driving my own vehicle again. I decided to drive down to that Pokestop since it was getting dark and I wanted to grab my Day 7 bonus before midnight. Day 7 is when you get the best rewards, then it resets back to Day 1. I pulled up to the stop, tapped my phone to collect the items, set it down on the passenger seat and started heading back home. The speed limit on these neighborhood roads is 20 miles per hour, but I was going even slower than that, maybe 12 or 13 at most. I was being cautious because of the recent accident, and the last thing I wanted was any more drama involving cars. I drove up this small hill and turned the corner when I saw a family walking along the side of the road. There was a woman, another woman who looked like her friend, and 3 kids with them. When they saw my car coming, the wife, her friend, and the 3 kids all moved to the side like normal people do. But this one guy, who I'm just going to call the entitled dad, was carrying a young boy who couldn't have been older than 3 or 4 in one arm. In his other hand, he was holding a beer bottle. And instead of stepping aside like everyone else, he actually stepped closer to my car and started yelling something at me. I hit the brakes and stopped completely. My heart was racing because I thought maybe something was wrong or maybe I'd done something dangerous without realizing it. I rolled down my window and called out to him, asking if everyone was all right and why he'd stepped toward my car like that. He asked me if I could see his family standing there. I told him yes and asked what his point was. He then accused me of driving too fast for the neighborhood. I should mention that my loaner car had Wisconsin plates on it, which probably made him think I wasn't from around here. I explained to him that I was only going about 12 miles per hour and the speed limit was 20, so I definitely wasn't speeding. He shot back that I'd almost hit him and his son. I pointed out that the only reason we gotten close was because he stepped toward a moving vehicle, and that he was the one putting his family in danger, not me. That's when he looked into my car and spotted my phone sitting on the passenger seat. His whole demeanor changed, like he'd found some kind of ammunition against me. He told me that he didn't know the laws in Wisconsin, but here in Illinois you can't be on your phone while driving. He said he was calling the police. I told him I didn't know Wisconsin's laws either because the car was just a loaner and I actually lived here in Illinois. He said that if I lived here then I should know the laws and repeated that he was calling the cops. I just told him to have fun with that and drove off. Maybe I should have stayed and tried to explain things properly, but I didn't think he was serious. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't on my phone while driving. I was going under the speed limit, and he was the one who stepped toward my car while holding a kid and a beer. The whole thing seemed ridiculous. I got home and made myself some ramen for dinner. I was sitting in my dining room, twirling noodles on my fork, when I looked out the window and nearly choked. The entitled dad was standing in front of my house, talking on his cell phone. He'd actually followed me home. My neighborhood is so small that the whole incident had happened maybe a 2 or 3 minute walk from my house, so he must have just walked straight here after I drove away. I felt my stomach drop because I realized this guy was serious about calling the cops. About 5 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up with 3 officers. I stepped outside, preparing myself for the worst. I genuinely thought I was about to get arrested for something I didn't do. The first officer asked if I knew why they were there. I told him I had a pretty good idea what he thought he was doing there, but I wanted to hear it from him first. He explained that the gentleman had called them saying I'd attempted to run his family over after getting caught texting while driving and going way over the speed limit. My brain just stopped working for a second. This guy had actually told the police that I tried to commit vehicular manslaughter. I took a breath and forced myself to focus. I explained that what he'd said was completely wrong. I told the officer I'd been driving home from playing Pokemon Go and that my phone had been in the passenger seat the entire time. I said that this man had stepped close to my car while I was driving. The entitled dad started yelling that I was lying and that I'd nearly killed his family. He demanded they arrest me right away. The second officer told him to calm down and that they'd settle this. The first officer asked me what the man had been doing when the incident happened. That's when it hit me. I remembered the beer bottle. I remembered him carrying that little boy while holding alcohol. And I realized I had a way to prove my side of the story. I told the officers that he'd been walking with his family along the side of the road, carrying a young boy on one arm and holding a beer bottle in the other. The entitled dad exploded, calling me a piece of garbage and saying it wasn't true. The second officer told him to control himself. I continued, explaining that when I drove by them, the rest of his family had moved to the side of the road, but he actually stepped closer to my car. I said I thought he got within an inch of me. The entitled dad kept insisting it was nonsense and that I was just trying to protect myself. The first officer told him that if what I was saying was true, he could actually be the one getting arrested, not me. The second officer asked if I was sure that's what happened. I said I was positive and that he'd gotten way too close to my moving vehicle while holding a child and a bottle of Miller Lite. That's when the entitled dad made his mistake. He blurted out that it wasn't Miller Lite, it was Budweiser. Then he cut himself off mid-word, realizing what he'd just admitted. I watched his face go pale. All 3 officers turned to look at him. He tried to backtrack and defend himself, but the damage was done. The third officer asked him if he'd had anything to drink that evening. The entitled dad stammered out a shaky no, his voice much less confident than before. They walked him over to one of the police cars and gave him a breathalyzer test right there on my front lawn. 0.12%, just over the legal limit. He ended up confessing that I was telling the truth about everything. They arrested him for public intoxication and child endangerment. One of the officers told me he'd have to go before a judge to determine if he was a danger to his family. They asked if I wanted to press any additional charges against him, but I said no. The guy already had enough legal trouble to deal with, and I just wanted the whole thing to be over. I already have to appear in court soon to dispute a traffic ticket from my accident. It'll be the 3rd time this year I've had to stand in front of a judge, and I really didn't want to add a 4th visit if I didn't have to. Though I suppose if his case goes far enough, I might end up being called as a witness anyway. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.